Hello, welcome. Welcome, everyone. I'm Mariana Siciliano, Managing Educator for Public Programs here at the Met, and want to thank you all for joining us today. We will begin by hearing an introduction by Monica Miller, guest curator of the exhibition Superfine, Tailoring Black Style, and professor and chair of Africana Studies, Barnard College at Columbia University. We'll then hear short presentations from our incredible panel of esteemed guest designers before transitioning into a conversation moderated by Monica. Without further ado, I am pleased to turn it over to Monica Miller to formally introduce today's program.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mariana. I am delighted to be here today with you and in conversation with Adeju, Wanda, and Imane. As many of you know, Superfine is a long cultural history of dandyism in the African diaspora. The story that we are telling in the exhibition proceeds through a series of juxtapositions, the primary one being between historical objects and garments and contemporary fashion. Superfine highlights contemporary Black fashion designers, so many of whom are not only artists and artisans, but also scholars and researchers, bringing histories of dress, adornment, craft, and tailoring into their work. In the exhibition, we celebrate the creativity and knowingness or cultural intelligence of designers of African descent, and we revel in the ways in which they uncover, reimagine, and push forward what Carol Tulloch calls style narratives in multiple contexts. So where are the African fashion designers in this story? Many have asked this question. Superfine focuses primarily on the diaspora and centers designers of African descent working in the US and Europe. As such, the exhibition reflects some of the limitations of my expertise, although there is an implicit and I think constant conversation with Africa and its imaginary. Throughout the curatorial process, the curatorial team and I considered how and whether we could represent African fashion design properly within the exhibit, given its incredible regional, national, and aesthetic diversity, and the success and thoroughness of, for example, the recent Africa Fashion Show, which was curated by Christine Chichinska, who was also on our advisory board. Instead of telling this part of the story insufficiently, we decided to utilize the existing expertise of platforms like Guzangs, which is dedicated to documenting and celebrating African fashion and global diasporic design. So I'm excited to be here today with three of Africa's and Guzang's most exciting and accomplished designers. I also want to thank Idel Tai and Leilani Pineda of Guzangs for working with us on this panel. Adele also recently wrote an excellent article for the Met's Perspectives magazine. Now, I'd like to thank our sponsors and also introduce our three panelists who represent themselves and whatever communities that they call in, but not the whole African continent. They will then, in the order that I mentioned them, introduce themselves and their work. Superfine and its accompanying publication would not have been possible without the generous support of numerous organizations and individuals. Our deepest gratitude goes to Louis Vuitton for their lead sponsorship of the exhibition. We also extend our thanks to Instagram, the Hobson Lucas Family Foundation, Africa Fashion International, which is founded by Dr. Precious Malloy Motsepe, and the Perry Foundation. We are especially grateful for the continued commitment from our long-standing partner, Condé Nast. And now to introduce our designers. Adeju Thompson is the founder of Lagos Space Program, a conceptual fashion and design studio at the intersection of art, cultural research, and craft. Their practice takes a decolonial approach to African design, rooted in Yoruba philosophy, queer theory, and post-colonial thought. Thompson's collections merge minimalist tailoring with political intent, using garments as both functional objects and cultural artifacts, with each project functioning as an inquiry into inherited aesthetics, the disruptions of colonialism, and the possibilities of diasporic futures. They are the winner of the 2023 International Woolmark Prize and the 2023 Fashion Trust Arabia Prize. Their work is held in the permanent collections of institutions, including the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Princeton University Art Museum, and the National Gallery of Victoria. Next, we'll hear from, introduce Wanda Lephoto. who is a Johannesburg-based ready-to-wear menswear brand that redefines luxury ready-to-wear, rooted in plural cultures, styles, tradition, and identity. Founded in 2018, Wanda Lephoto explores a notion of luxury dress, merging African cultures, traditions, identities, and approaches with global nuances. Founded on research that encompasses critical thinking and speculative theory, cultural fusion, spiritual literature, and historical sources, Wanda Lephoto fuses two worlds, an evolving modernity and a nostalgic subculture history to create new propositions for identity and representation. Concerned with the identities of otherwise underrepresented bodies and groups, Black identity is at the core of Wanda Lephoto's inspiration for contemporary tailored and formal wear, creating a space that allows people freedom to negotiate the boundaries of their own representation. And finally, Imane Ayissi was born in Cameroon, the son of a family of artists and sportsmen. After relocating to Paris in the 1990s, he started to design small collections. Since 2010, he has decided to present complete collections during Paris Haute Couture Week. Since January 2020, his collection has been integrated into the official Haute Couture calendar, invited by the Fédération de la Haute Couture et de la Mode in Paris. He is the first sub-Saharan designer to be invited into the official Haute Couture calendar in Paris as a guest member. The garments of Imane Ayissi's couture line combine African craftsmanship, heritage materials, and fabrics together with his use of innovative design and haute couture skills. There is also an infusion of references to African cultures and history, as well as to Parisian haute couture and contemporary creativity. Imane Ayissi is a luxury brand involved in ethical and sustainable production with an almost exclusive use of natural and, as much as possible, organic materials, the respect of craft work, and also traditional skills. So welcome our designers, and I'm going to ask Adeju now to say a little bit more about their work and process. Adeju, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you so much, Monica. It's a huge honor to be on this panel. I'm a huge fan of Wanda and Imane, and it's a huge honor to continue the conversation with, around the exhibition at the Met. So yeah, Lagos Space Program. Lagos Space Program is multidisciplinary practice based out of Lagos, Nigeria. Our work is based around ready-to-wear research and also just ready-to-wear and research. Those are our main things. I'm also a practicing artist, so those are the main tenets of my work. My aim of my work is centered around decolonizing design and really sort of like showing that African fashion is very expansive, the fact that I, as an individual, am not disconnected from my interests. So like my interests reflect my work. So whether it be my interest in music, in art, my little quirks, all of that inform my practice. I always sort of like say it's this idea of like my interests filtered through a Nigerian lens, and that's really what informs my work. Thank you very much. So yeah, I have a little presentation here that I like to sort of like share with everybody about my work. I've curated a selection of images that really reflect the ethos, the different principles of my work, and really what informs my imagination and the work that I do. So yeah, please, let's proceed. So yeah, like I said, the main aspect of my work is exploring queer theory. And in one of my earlier collections, which was my project 5, which is probably about 4 years ago now, I explored the idea of the Glade masquerade and the Glade spectacle. It's a ritual practice that happens in Southwest Nigeria amongst the Yorubas. And I found it really fascinating because, like, growing up in Nigeria as a queer person, there's always been this idea that queerness is the sort of like, Western import. And I like the idea of sort of like using my research to sort of like dismantle, mistruths. And upon my research, I discovered this sort of like, community, and, this masquerade practice in Southwest Nigeria that really sort of like celebrated the feminine energy, and the primordial female forces, but really embodied by men. So it was literally men sort of like gender bending. And I found that very, very fascinating, and that's really, and that really sort of like informed my practice, but also sort of like has really sort of like been like a sort of how will I describe it? Like sort of like foundation for how I've sort of like built my practice. And on this page, you can sort of like see the Gilede masquerade cradling a baby. Underneath it, there's a work of Rotimi Fani Kayode. And I think the aim of this page is really sort of like showing this idea of showing queerness from a historical perspective and also queerness from a contemporary perspective. Rotimi Fani Kayode is one of my favorite artists, and his work really reflects what I try to do with my work. This idea of the intersections of queerness and Yoruba identity, fusing that together to sort of like really create a very compelling story, like a story that is very much like the version, like there always sort of this idea of like the zeitgeist. What is Nigeria's conversation to that? And I feel like, Rotimi's work really embodies that. So next, please. So here in this page, you really sort of like see me, really using a lot of my Glede research in my work, how it reflects in my work. Here is the mask, a Glede mask, a sort of like a how I sort of like say a fantasized interpretation of a Glede mask, and this was a collaboration with a dear friend of mine in London called David Gardner. And we tried to sort of like create a mask that really represented held the memories of who we are, but also like tapped into this sort of like, historical idea of like, queerness. And in the image below it is, another part of the same collection where we sort of like try to also explore that, but also in part of my post-Adire research. So this is like an Adire knitwear. So basically we do the Adire, the resist dye, and we dye it in organic indigo, and then we sort of we deconstruct it and we knit it. And this was a collaboration with another artist, Alexander, based in Germany. And it was really about, okay, how can we sort of like push Adire farther, and also in the image, we have this, the sort of like phallic bronze objects. This is part of the idea of like playing with masculinity. So next. Here is, part of what I find really fascinating about Yoruba culture. I call this aspect indigenous engineering, which is really me studying how we dress traditionally, why our ancestors made what they made, why it's cut the way it is, why the goddess are arranged the way they are. And, just finding it really fascinating. And if you go on to the next page, you see like how that reflects in my work. This is an agbada that's made entirely from knitwear. And we really try to, for me, like I just thought there's so much about how we dress that's so perfect that when I was trying to make this, I was like, I didn't want to tamper with the form. I was like, it's perfect. How can we sort of like disrupt it? I am a contemporary designer. How can I move this forward? And that's really what this agbada this piece, reflects. There's a lot of research in how could we sort of like reflect this sort of like technical ideas, like the goddess of the agbada, the embroidery in a way that really made sense. And we tried our best to sort of like achieve that. And you can sort of like see in this image. So yeah, next page. Here is some images from my Project 9 collection, which is Ojude, Invitation to Ojude Oba. The collection reflects this sort of like fantasized idea of this fictional Yoruba British person, who gets invited by the Alake of Egbalan to the Ojude Oba festival. And the collection sort of like imagines what his wardrobe will be like. This idea of someone who is completely decolonized, someone who sort of like is queer, but someone who sort of like, plays with both their British heritage and their Yoruba heritage in the same way, in a way that nothing really overpowers each other. And it was really a fun collection to explore. So next, please. Here is me playing with more sort of like Yoruba code. So here's this like model from my most recent collection that I showed in Paris Fashion Week. And he's wearing like a lace set. And lace is something that's part of like Yoruba culture, the Owambe style. And I like the idea of sort of like making things very contemporary, very modern in a way that members of my community and will find really appealing. Because a lot of times, a lot of these design aspects really sort of like stay in this very archival space, or whether it's how we wear dress traditionally. And for me, it's like, how can we move this into a very sort of like a ready to wear, way whereby it's more accessible to a broader audience. Next, please. Here is a page I call the Rabid Aesthete. Some of my favorite people, Andre Leontali, Cecil Beaton, and these wonderful Yoruba gentlemen in London in the 1930s. That image is what is like the center of my practice. It really sort of like reflects what I try to achieve through my work. And here also you sort of like see the Prince of Wales on horseback. And it's really how I sort of like see my work, always sort of like taking and borrowing from different spaces. Like as a designer, I don't feel the need to like, I feel like my African identity is expansive and I get to sort of like play with different things. So next page, please. Here is part of my research with the Ojude collection. And here is this double-breasted suit that's informed by Adire really. And this idea of sort of like reauthoring, or essentially this is meant to be informed by the like sort of like a Prince of Wales check. And it's sort of like reinterpreted in Adire, this idea of like, something that's very sort of like colonial now becoming very Yoruba in its language. And that really sort of like really reflects really how I sort of like try to approach my work. So next, please. Here is more of my post-Adire exploration. In the bottom left image, you can sort of like see the model when a print that's informed by my personal Ifa divination. So about 3 years ago, I met up with a Babalao where we documented my personal Ifa divination. And I found it really interesting. I thought this idea of like, how can I sort of like put more of myself in my work? And if you know about Ifa divination, you know how, it's very personal and like this idea of post-Adire, but also this idea of code and dressing. And it's something that I really enjoy that I hope to continue exploring. But yeah, this is really me about pushing Adire towards the future. Next, please. Here is more of my post-Adire exploration, trying to really show that Adire, can be expansive, not just in a very archival way, but also sort of like showing in a very contemporary context via like a tapestry. Thank you very much. I think we have one more page. And the last page really reflects more of this idea of disrupting, indigenous textile and indigenous techniques, whether it's via bronze casting or adire, but really sort of like moving them towards the future. Here you have a model with a sort of like bronze buckle and a sort of like bronze bag. And really sort of like when I go to these spaces, it's really about disruption. I'm not trying to like come back with the same thing, but like how can I use the knowledge, this indigenous knowledge, and bring it to the future? And that's really what really reflects my practice at Lagos Space Program. So thank you very much.
Hi. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Adeju. Thank you, Imane. What an honor to be here with everyone. Thank you to the Guzangs gang. Thank you so much. My name is Wanda Lephoto, and of my namesake brand, Wanda Lephoto. I guess on my side, my story sort of predates me, and how Wanda Lephoto came about is in the year 1995, my late sister, who passed on in the same year, was in a fashion TV commercial from a retailer brand. And 1995 is just 1 year post-apartheid, which is a very significant part of South African history. And then in this fashion TV commercial, she's 10 years old and she's dancing and she's this ballerina girl that does this routine. And at the end of it, it ends off with the caption says, blah, 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 retailer, the new face of beauty. Speaking about my young sister. And that film I grew up really watching, and I grew up thinking about that what did they mean, this new face of beauty, as a young person. And I got to understand the older I grew, that they were talking about Black people becoming the new face of beauty in this new post-apartheid world in South Africa, where I guess Black South Africans couldn't negotiate the boundaries of their own beauty, the boundaries of their own identity, because they were oppressed and couldn't necessarily tell their own stories. And that's the essence and the spirit in which essentially Wanda Lephoto was drawn from, because I wanted to address those issues, but I also wanted to dress physically this new face of South African beauty that would hold these conversations in new light and physically put clothes on them. But not only just clothes, stories, and also have this hand-to-hand conversation with them about how we envision a new future for South Africa and for the rest of the world. So please, can we go on to the next slide as I go through my work? This image is an image I found myself, a colonial image I found at Museum Africa, which is one of the museums in South Africa that I was honored to be a part of, working on an exhibition called Fashion Accounts in Museum Africa, which puts into account museums and what sort of images they were collecting, what sort of histories they were collecting, and what sort of exhibitions they were putting out during these oppressive times. And this is one of the images that I had found. And in my work, we really look at critical research, critical histories to really inform our practice, really inform our design, really inform the sort of conversations that we want to have. And this is an image of a young boy in the year 1912, photographed, a Zulu boy. This is traditional Zulu attire, one of the cultures and tribes of South Africa. And this, for us, really shows, in some way, the human spirit, which really informs and inspires the work that we do, this research that's deeply rooted in human interaction, human behavior, human histories, and human connection. Next, please. This image is from our Black Renaissance Fall 2022, which looks at this idea of cultural fusion. And this cultural fusion being the coming together or the blending and merging of two worlds to create new propositions for new conversations, new narratives, new explorations within design, new conversations. And this looks at the previous image, which is traditional Zulu attire from an African culture, with the top half being Western global nuances, suit, tie, and a blazer. And this, in many ways, represents a church uniform in South Africa from the Shembe Church. And so looking at this human spirits, human connection, human fusion, what happens when history collides and creates these new identities that become long-standing histories that get practiced even in places like the church that are informed by colonization and oppression, but are expressed through church, through faith. And looking at these themes, like what does this mean that faith, history, the spirit, religion can be explored through themes that were colonized, and these people are going to church wearing a shirt, tie, when that wasn't their uniforms. So looking at these sort of histories and grappling with them, exploring with them, expanding them, and revealing them in ways that questions where they come from, where can they go? Can these uniforms be redesigned for a future? And what does that look like? How do we negotiate those boundaries? Next, please. This image comes from a collective I was a part of called the Sartists. And this image really looks at themes of restoring memory, coming from South Africa, which has a colonial and apartheid history of oppression. Some of the violences that happened in South Africa were the oppressive systems came into Black homes, destroyed family albums, destroyed evidence through photos, through clothes of Black people, so that they couldn't have any trace of their histories. And a part of restoring this memory is to put myself, put my friends, and collectively put ourselves in these situations where we reimagine these histories, renegotiate these things. Like I remember in a book, Black Santa Mufokeng talking about tennis being considered a white man's activity. But there's evidence clearly of images from the 1910s, 1920s of Black people participating in sports like tennis. So this is from that, this idea of reimagining ourselves as our ancestors, engaging in these things that were considered white people's activities, and sort of redressing that conversation. Next, please. I just want you to look at this image for a second and then move on to the next image again. Next, please. So the past image really also looks at African icons as the center of the fashion world, as the center of art, fashion, and design. And sort of we use these often neglected, often not celebrated icons to really inform how we design, really inform how we shoot our lookbooks, really inform how we treat our conversations, really inform what we do at Wanda Lephoto, but also to celebrate them and to give them highlight when they've often been neglected by the Western world. And the previous image is by an icon, Samuel Fosso in his book Autobiography, where he documents his life from a youth up until now, and he is one of the people that inspires us. So this is from Our People collection, Spring Summer 2024, where we use this as an inspiration. Next, please. Once again, please look at this image and move on to the next image. And these next images, I'll just ask you to move to the end just for people to see the rest of them. These images are really inspired by travel, community, our friends, tailoring, and combining all these essences where people often look at African fashion and think African fashion is always meant to be patterns, bold and loud, but African fashion is meant to be what we make it to be. And sometimes that luxury exists as a conversation, sometimes it exists as the craftsmanship, sometimes it exists as a process of friendship in which we weave these conversations together. And this is really what my work represents. Thank you.
Bonjour. Je suis Imane Ayissi, d'origine
my name is Imane Ayissi, and I'm from Cameroon, but I live in Paris, precisely. In France, but precisely in Paris, and I work there. And I was always attracted by Paris because it's a place where you meet a lot of people different. There's a lot going on in the cultural world, you know. Now we could go to the next slide, please. I was a dancer when I was young, dance for singers, for dance companies. I was also a model for luxury brands, and I've collaborated and worked for a number of luxury products, for photo shoots, for catalogs, and for art pictures, for jewel, and that work, my work in the model world, you know, that made me discover the world of luxury, and through that, I became involved in creating. Next slide, please. And here we see a picture where we see a dress, someone wearing a dress, and the fabric comes from Burkina Faso, Faso d'Anfani. And in a way, I look at things, I always wanted to do more research, you know, on all the old way of producing fabrics, you know, knowing that Africa is not a country, it's a continent. And therefore, we have many different cultures, and the know-hows are also different from one place to the other. So, you know, so that's a front here that where we show the extraordinary know-how in Burkina Faso, where they produce extremely refined fabrics with very basic cottons initially. And I've worked with a number of craftsmen, and they always showed me that they can do a great finishing with their fabrics, so that they are comfortable to wear, and that they can create also product for the luxury industry. And they also explain and show me the certain ways on of stitching and the various techniques that they use with the needles. Next slide, please. Yes, so here we are still on the first picture. We're still talking about, you know, Ivorian works of Ivorian fabrics, are very old techniques. You know, it's important for me to show that, but it shows that African has a lot of potential in terms of traditional know-hows, and but we need to modernize it as best as we can, so that the world can discover our know-how. And through each collection, I try to promote these fabrics so that people discover them. And I work with different countries such as Côte d'Ivoire, sometimes Nigeria, sometimes Senegal, sometimes other, and Cameroon as well. And the yellow dress is raffia. Raffia is important. Why is it important? Because it's a very, it's a crochet raffia. It's a very important. It's a raw material, and but it's a challenge. How to work based on the very raw material and to make it very sophisticated and to get this raffia crochet. Like how to be sophisticated enough to, to be accepted in the luxury international stage. So you need to work on it. You need to think about the know-how. You need to work on it. Think about the forms or the color. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it. Next slide, please. Here we see two coats. These are kente coats. It's a very beautiful fabric that comes from Ghana. It's a royal fabric, that was used to build a fabulous gift. See, when I cut it, I respect the lines of the fabric because I work with a lot of craftsmen in Ghana. We choose carefully the colors, the embroidering that goes with that. It's not easy, but we do our best. And after working on that, on the various work, when the bands come to Paris, we compose them, we cut them, in order to assemble them. And you see that, the different, kind of a mosaic coat on the right. And we see that that is something that we've shown in the official haute couture week in Paris in 2020. The dress, is also presented on haute couture week, and we see that the brands of raffia. It is to promote the excellence and the work of craftsmen in Africa. We want to show that Africa has a huge potential and to be presented in the luxury stage, but it requires a lot of work. We need to show a lot of imagination, and we need to have a lot of trust the craftsman as much as we can, of course. Next slide, please. So we're still on the raffia theme. I love raffia. Raffia is a material that is very present. It's very important for Africa. I always say that it's the equivalent of with the spangles in the Western world, because raffia is always everywhere in Africa. Whenever you have a wedding or a funeral or in any event, it's there. So that in that sense, it's important for me to sublimate it, to transcend it, and to work on it, and to work on the colors and the shapes, and to create dresses, for haute couture. And it shows that Africa has a lot of materials and a lot of potential. Next slide, please. Here we're still with raffia, but other shapes now. We have raffia dresses, and we have the stockings that are, made out of silk, and we see the sun here, everywhere here. It explodes. It's fantastic. It required a lot of work. It's a very sophisticated work, but these forms and these shapes are, talking to us. It's magical to see them like this, this shape. We have the colors of gold and superimposition of fabric over fabric. It's very interesting. Yeah. Next slide, please. Here we see the bomb. So it's an old form, when it's done, you have these round little, and we use many different of them to create different shapes, and it's stitched, one to the other. And after that, I embroidered with a little pearls, little pearls also, so that's also for haute couture with multicoloring of the different forms. And it's all about the composition and the way it's put together that makes it interesting. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Here we see four silhouettes or profiles, so the one in the middle is an homage to Namibia. So it's a patchwork, everything is cut out and is stitched, and one by one. You also have cotton shirts on both sides, right and right side. You have a Safo culture shirt, from Ghana, and all of that is important because I love to tell stories. Africa is huge, and each nation you have many different stories to tell. Yeah, so many different things to see. So each time, what I do is that I try to bring the world somewhere to make you discover a specific part of Africa, which I found so rich. Next slide, please. And here, it's also weaving of Côte d'Ivoire, which is very modern, with the Ishantoun stitching. It's very refined work, and that also it's important to show this. And here we have the association of the embroidering and the traditional weaving to show that it's possible to have both with when you work on and with silk. What's important to remember with this type of work is that the African material, fabrics have a lot of potential. Now it's just that Africans should trust themselves, get more assurance in themselves, and therefore they will, when they have that, they will accede to the international stage of luxury products and luxury brands. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. That was really phenomenal and so amazing to also see your images and to also have you talk about your work. There are a number of things that I think a number of topics that I think you're all touching on, and I'm going to try to the best of my ability, bring those out. I mean, I have one question that's a little bit more, I think, philosophical and aesthetic, and then I have another set of questions that are a little bit more practical and kind of business oriented. So I'll start with the sort of aesthetic question. Adeju, when you were talking, and then I think you and Wanda were really talking so much about moving tradition forward, right? About pushing the bound. I mean, about pushing the sort of boundaries of traditional aesthetics. And I think Imane was showing that also through his work. So I'm really interested in this. In this idea, and this is something that we talked about in the preparation for this, right? Is what we talked a little about what it means to be an African fashion designer, but I'm thinking about something more specific about the relationship between sort of tradition, right, and authenticity. Right, or this relationship in terms of what Imane was suggesting about the relationship between tradition, authenticity, and certain forms of sophistication, right? That the Western fashion world, in particular ways, really seems to value. So I'm wondering how you think about that in terms of your work. Like, do those terms even come up for you? Right. I mean, do you think about yourself as an African fashion designer? Are you really concerned at all, right, about, or in what ways are you concerned about authenticity, right, as you tap into various kinds of traditions, either traditions of wear, textile traditions, craftsmanship. So I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, I think, like you said, I mean, for me, the most important thing with my work is authenticity. I try to be as bold and as expansive as I can be with my work. Really sort of like push the material and push the aesthetic further. Really sort of like take, design from a Nigerian perspective into spaces
Right.
it's never been. A lot of times when I go to spaces, whether I'm in Oshobo, I'm doing my dyeing, or I'm in Benin City, like, I'm so like, enamored by the rich history I come from. But I always have this sense of frustration also because like while I'm like I'm so impressed with the technicality and the incredible works, whether it's the Ife heads or the beading bronzes, it's like, okay, like it's sort of like how do I put it? It's like an amber. It's like static, and I'm always like, okay, cool, but like we come from this rich heritage, and I'm sure like our ancestors would have hoped and thought that would always move things forward. And I think for me, that's my aim with my work. Like, how do I move things forward? How do I create work that is, I mean, LSP is sold in Japan, in Korea, in the UK, in the States. Like, how do I propose an object or garment and you understand it from emotion and the codes that really sort of like you sort of like connect with? I think that's really what really informs my practice. How can I create something that feels right? How can I sort of like keep on pushing? I always describe myself as a sort of like eternal student of fashion. I'm a great admirer of the work of John Galliano, Martin Margiela, and Emile Mista. Like how, like when I discovered their works, it was very different from, anything I saw in Nigeria. Nigerian fashion, from my perspective then, was very much like, this idea of like, dress to impress. And through their works, I saw something that was very introspective, very sort of like vulnerable. And I was like, I want to be that. And I try to reflect that energy in my work. So even if I'm doing Adire, it's like, initially you might not even know what Adire is, but you're just like, oh wow, like I love that, a motif. I love that pattern because it speaks to you. It's very familiar. And that's because like, I'm tapping into this sort of like global conversation. I exist in 2025 and none of these
Right.
things are separate from who I am.
I guess the question, I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. I mean, the other question I had, and that maybe somebody else can address is there's a way in which I think all of you have for a reverence for history, a reverence for craft, a reverence for what's come before, but also an impatience, right? With a good impatience, right? With how with I think thinking forward, moving forward into the future. So I'm also interested in how you think about that reverence, right? And then what you
I think with my work, I said this in the previous meeting, I'm very interested in this idea of beauty or trauma. And to give context to what I mean about that is, for example, if you look at the white shirt, in its origin, it comes from the Western world, but in its context and nuance, very much belongs, it's a very African product. And I say that for me because when the colonizers, for example, came to South Africa, they gave that white shirt to people and they said, this is the white shirt that represents hope, cleanliness, blah, 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 blah. And this white shirt to this day still gets used in churches and schools as a daily object of wear. And for me, sort of wanting to break down the stereotype that people have that African fashion is a print, a color, blah, blah, blah. The white shirt becomes an African product in its context, and it becomes valid in its use in the number of years that it's existed in the context of South Africa or within Africa. So my work really is interested in looking at things from that sort of perspective and designing on top of that legacy and that history, whether it's pain, beauty, or trauma. What can I contribute to the conversation that begins to deconstruct these colonial context, that begins to deconstruct these Western ideas of subcultures, dress, tailoring, what is tailoring, and how can we subvert that to really fit in this context a new kind of future where we become the owners of themes such as dandyism, of themes such as tailoring in a way that is freeing on us and doesn't impose Western sort of connotations.
Yeah, I mean, I always sort of like if I can add to it, I always sort of like say this idea of like Africa in conversation. I think that's always very essential. Like it's like what is it in conversation with, like I'm not like just like caged up on the continent, I get to partake in everything that's going on, whether it's like my interest in rock and roll, in the kind of art I like, and it's like how do I sort of like collage those ideas? And it's always like a huge frustration for me. And I don't think it's only a Western problem. I think it's also like a problem of what we also impose on ourselves as Africans.
Yeah.
I think, there's this idea of like, African fashion, it must be very robust, was very colorful, and and it's like, and or I mean, remember in the earlier days of my practice, some people would tell me like, just design, just make clothes, like what's all this research, and it's like for a lot of people, that's what African design, it's very un-African to sort of like embody that. But I always sort of like say it's actually very un-African to not be as sort of like, sensitive and, elaborate, because like we are very,
Oh, yeah.
very deeply researched people. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking about that in relationship to your work, Imane, in terms of the conversation, right? So much of the presentation you just gave us was really about different kinds of conversations that you are enabling, right? In terms of your use of different kinds of fabric and textile traditions from different parts, right? I mean, primarily of West Africa, but I'm wondering what you might have to say about that.
C'est toujours un dialogue entre différents tissus. Ce qui concerne
So, with regard to the textile, this is a world on its own. It's also a dialogue. And how do you make things speak to each other? You have to find pathways to inspiration, how to put things together side by side to create images that speak to each other between different textiles, different materials. For example, textile coming from Cameroon, from Senegal, from Nigeria. There's textile from Togo, from Benin. And I try to put them side by side with Western textile from the United States, Asia, to put in contrast these African textiles so that they can speak to the international textiles, to create a language of fashion. So you have to know things. Africa has always had a heritage in textile. Talk about Kente, Bogoland from Mali, Bogoland from Kente from Ghana, textile from Nigeria, Lomom from Cameroon, or the raffias from Cameroon. So there's a whole world of textiles in Africa. So it is up to the African designers, Africans, to promote this so that people can know these things. When we talk about African design, African fashion, what is an African designer? For me, when we understand the codes, when we see how it works, when we understand how international fashion works, because we want to work on the international level, first, there's a designer. When you look at the work done by the designers, how to dress women on an international scale, in an international context, you have to ask questions. You have to look at the clothing. Is it designed properly so that the fashion houses can adopt it? Chanel, for example, it's a well-made garment. Then there's Coco Chanel or Mr. Yves Saint Laurent. For us African designers, when we've reached that point, then we know how to speak to others. There's a nice finished product, even if we provide identities, connotations, maybe in the weave, the color, how the clothes are going to fall and embrace the body, how to knot a cloth on the body. But at the base, we have to understand how they work. We have to know the know-how very deeply. And that's something that has demanded a lot of work on my part. So there's African countries, but there's also the world.
in Paris.
Each country has something else going on in it. The importance is not only the culture, but beliefs. So everything has to be understood, respected. And how do you take all of that to produce something that will speak to the fashion world so you can actually dress people without feeling, not having a complex about it and without shocking?
I guess I want to bring up something that that's related to what you were just suggesting, Imane, and that's a little bit about the politics of location, right? I know that both, I think, Adeju and Wanda, you're both working on the continent now, but you have also shown in Europe, right? And Imane is based in Paris. And Wanda, you mentioned when you were talking about the relationship between beauty and trauma, you've also talked about, you know, in some ways following, right? Following the fashion calendar, right? You've also described in those terms, you know, trying to think through, right, that that as a kind of problematic. So I guess I'm interested in what are some of the rewards, right, that you've all taken from those experiences, right, of you know, being showcased, right, in the center, right, of what people think of as the center of world fashion, and then what are some of the challenges, right, the challenges of the choices that you've made to work at home, right, to have your production at home, right, to work with artisans, right, on the continent in Imane's case. So I'm wondering how you think about that. Like, what are the things that you are dedicated to and really interested in terms of working locally, right, in Lagos or Nigeria, in South Africa, or you know, or what are some of the challenges of doing that, right, as a designer right now?
I think for me, I'm really, really interested in working at home right now. And I think it's this idea of restoring memory and restoring pride. Restoring pride in things that are built from where I'm from, and reminding people that it's important to take care of here as well. And I think the aspirations of going to showcase in Europe and in the Western world, those aspirations will always be there, but I'm not guided by them as their fundamental principle and as my end goal. More so what I think, what me, my community here, my friends, peers and designers, what Adeju is doing in Nigeria and other peers and friends there, I think what they're trying to do is really rejig and make our places the center of fashion and invite the global conversation and global communities into where we're from so that they can come and participate in fashion here and see it from a different perspective. And it's not to just look at us from a fashion point of view, but it's actually really to participate in the conversations we're having about textile, about sustainability, about community, and about this interaction that's very flawed from a Western perspective, I feel. Which just looks at it from a maybe whatever capitalistic point of view, but really lacks in some instances the richness of inspiration, the richness of community, the richness of this hand-to-hand, person-to-person human spirit and human interaction that really creates this ecosystem in which clothes get made. And I think that's what I'm really interested in. And yes, participating globally then from a different kind of point, like from a secondary point of view where I can go to enjoy the participation and enjoy to exercise my freedom and enjoy how I design clothes, but not necessarily need that system. So for me right now, I'm really interested in growing home and restoring the pride in African textiles, African fashion, African design, conversations that we're having, and not necessarily get looked at through a traumatic colonial lens at times that I've found that when I participate in Western spaces, I'm often quite tense and unable to really communicate some of my inspirations, some of where these things come from without people misinterpreting them through their sort of a skewed lens.
Yeah. So yeah, I really thank you, Wanda, for sharing that. It was really incredible. So yeah, I've showcased core collections in Paris. And while like, I recently made a decision to sort of like step away, it's been a mixed bag in the sense that, like it was like a dream of mine to sort of like be in Paris and show in Paris and sort of like, like I said, I described myself as a sort of like eternal student and like, I was there, I was the guy in Lagos, on YouTube watching the Dior show and I was like, I want to put myself in that context. But I think there's something about this idea of like inheriting a dream and like, okay, this is what it's like. And when you get there, you realize, oh wow, it's very, very different. So I would say there were times when I felt like, okay, like, it's not just about, being talented. This is a very oversaturated market. There's so much to look at. I remember like one of my invitation to a judo bar collection. I remember I was speaking with my PR and I was like, it's like, okay, what are you thinking about your show? Like, how do you want to present? Like, oh, I could do some sort of like really cool salon thing. I could talk about each look and really talk about the really real like in-depth research and textile techniques I really explored. And he sort of like he was it was his job, but he was like, no, you can't do that. There's no time. Look, I've called on favors. There's somebody who's going to go to the Dior show who's going to come to you, and he can only give you 2 minutes. So I think it was sort of like a shock. I was like, oh wow, so that I feel like I had to like adjust to. And also like, I just feel there were moments when like people will tell me like, oh, like, whether like, oh, what is too African? I remember with my first season after winning the Walmart prize, there was like I was in the showroom and there's this like particular buyer that my agent wanted me to meet. And she just like didn't come to the space, she just stood afar and she like walked away. So we ended up inquiring like why didn't she come? And she was like, it's too African. And it was like, okay, but like that's not all my work embodies. It's so much expansive than that. And I remember like after that time, like I'd have to like when like buyers would come, I'd sort of like make them sit down and I'll dress the models in the clothes. And like, oh wow, it's so Belgian. It's in that aesthetic. I was like, yeah, like I'm that girl. Like I am this person. I'm this person. Like this is like where I sort of like I sit in, and like I'm proposing something different from a very different perspective. But I always sort of like feel like a lot of people don't really understand what it means, what African identity is, how expansive it is. People have a very like whether it's like maybe it's like a Lion King collection, like that is African fashion. So when you're coming into this space and sort of like saying, oh, you're creating a collection that's inspired by, invitation to a judo bar or like rock and roll consciousness, my last collection. Like, what do you know about rock and roll? It's like, yeah, my African identity was me listening to David Bowie and like Joy Division on the streets of Lagos. Like, I didn't know what you expected. So it's like really sort of like challenging that. And I feel like eventually I got tired. It's also very expensive, and I was like, you know what? I think I want to go back home, really sort of like build my community here and shine from Nigeria out. The 4 years, the 4 seasons have been incredible in terms of my networking. But I think it's time that I really sort of like really hone in on what, I feel more confident in a way that I'd always sort of like say, oh, yeah, I'm an independent designer, but I never sort of like fully embodied that. And I feel like I have the audacity to sort of like say, I only show one collection a year and really stand by it in a way that I couldn't like, a few years ago. Like this is what I stand for. This is my manifesto. This is what I believe in. And really sort of like go after that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Imane.
Comme vous le savez, dans tous les métiers, il faut des bases et les codes.
As you know, in any business, any craft, you need the basis, you need codes, and they are the local, elements, are the basis. That's true also for haute couture. There's a lot of work that is required. You have many different styles, and after that, you adopt it or you follow that. That's a choice that you make. You don't have to, but there are a number of things that exist that are there already, and that the work, the main industry knows, and after that, you have to decide what you want to do. I've decided to talk the way that I do because I thought I would be more visible. Paris is the capital of fashion. Paris has a lot of people there, there there's a lot going on. It's true, so it's a very prominent in terms of the fashion world, in the art world. And so for me, it was important to be here in Paris because the meetings in the fashion weeks and so on and so forth, there's a huge showcasing and promotion. It's celebrated the fashion, the know-hows, the couture, whether it's the press or the consumers, the clients, they buy. You have these fashion historians, everybody's there, and we don't have that in Africa yet. So I think that Africa needs to build up this stage, and sometimes we do just for because we want to do things, but we're still missing a lot of things. There's not a lot of setups that are missing, a lot of concrete things that are missing. But the promotion of our values, of certain icons that can be an inspiration for designers. These are the things that we need to take into account in Africa. Also, the consumer that are real client. Me as a designer that creating haute couture, do I have Black clients? Do I have African clients? I need to. I have to, give a report always to the Federation of Haute Couture in France. But it's what I mean to say is that it's important we follow the movement. The industry, Africans, Blacks have always been consumers in that world. But it's important that we are builders also, and so that we can mix better with the rest of the world. And we can mix with the rest of the world's know-how, the know-hows of the Africans. So the power of know-how, the power of money, that these are important factors also, and respect comes out of that too. So Africans should understand that it's not enough to buy to be consumer. You need to get good information, to promote and disseminate good information, and then we will mix better with the rest of the world. Because each country has a right to have a luxury stage, a luxury industry, so for me, it's been 12 seasons that I've done with no interruption to present my collections in haute couture. But I don't have Black customers. I have to say it. Sometimes I need to be frank and direct. But it's also a question of education, because haute couture is very French. It's a French culture that comes out of that, and the know-how that they have. But also in Africa, Africans and Black have a knowledge of they have a culture of aesthetics. So how can we transform that into a business? How do we can commercialize that, so that we get orders, we need to, conception. We need to promote the values, and respect for us will come out of that once we get there.
We have run, thank you, Imane. We have run over time, and it's a shame because we could go on. I just barely scratched the surface, but one of the things that I think Imane was mentioning there, that I think is so important that you all mentioned in a certain kind of way, was building, right? You all as designers are building, right? Futures, right? Very much you're all talking about futures, really building futures for African fashion, for African fashion designers, in different but really, I think, related ways, right? So I want to thank you. Also, you talk so much about conversations, right? Dialogues, the creation of new languages, right? Whether that's language, design language, or other kinds of language, with the kinds of work that you do as researchers, as scholars, right? So I'm really, really thankful for our conversation today, right? And thank you so much, all of you. Again, as I mentioned before we started, I was really, really excited to actually learn so much more about your work. We'll be following you. We'll be following Guzangs. We'll be following African fashion, right, in the future. But thank you so much for being here with us today. And here's to the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to you.
Merci, thank you.